Kia ora tātou, nau mai, haere mai, and welcome to this Founders' Day Assembly, 25th September 2020. It's my pleasure to welcome our chaplain, Reverend Ben Arcus, to lead us in our school prayer.
Thank you. Let's pray. Almighty God, giver of wisdom and light, send down upon our school the gifts of your Holy Spirit. May true religion, sound learning, and good sportsmanship here forever flourish and abound. Grant your guidance in daily life to all who teach and all who learn. May we and all who dwell in this place so worship you and serve you with faithfulness and courage at all times, that the school may be held in honour and your holy name be glorified, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Would you please stand for the first hymn?
In the hall, please be seated. So welcome, and quite a bit of this assembly will be quite rightly devoted to Mr. Grant Harper. And can I just say it's great to have Grant and Victoria here today. And to be honest, before we go any further, it's my privilege to welcome Victoria to our assembly here today. And Sebastian Clive Griffin has just got a little presentation he'd like to make to you. It's lovely to be able to welcome friends, family, current parents, previous parents, old boys, and of course family members to this special assembly here today. It's nice to have a number of Grant and Victoria's family here, and I'd just like to acknowledge the effort that many of them have made in these challenging times to make it to this very special occasion, so we are deeply indebted to you for that. In terms of Grant and Victoria's children here today, son James and their daughters Alice from Whangarei and Hannah and her husband Charlie and their little daughter Romilly are here today as well, so a very warm welcome to you. It's also nice to have Grant's brother Paul from the Hawke's Bay with us, and his sister Yolande and husband Tom from Tauranga. Victoria's family are here in force as well, and a special welcome to Victoria's father Judge Michael Hobbs and friend Yvonne, Nikki and Lisa Hobbs and Also, a special welcome to current Board of Trustees Chair, Mr. George Murdoch, and fellow board members. We have some former headmasters and principals here today, and it's my pleasure to welcome Bruce and his wife Gwyn Livick. Willie Kirsten is here with us today. It's great to have you here again, Willie, with apologies from his wife Ellie, and we also received apologies from John and Sarah Taylor, who would love to be here with us, but unfortunately that hasn't been possible. Amongst the many people we have here with a strong association with our school, it's nice to acknowledge past TSTB chairs Tom Bunny, Roger Gardner and John Sexton, and past BOT trustee Chris Edge, and certainly past BO chairs Andy Pottinger and Jonathan Hooker. It's great to have you here back in the college today. So in terms of the significance of this occasion and for the benefit of some of the young men here, today we celebrate our annual Founders Day, a little bit later than normal, but that's because we've had some challenging times. For all of us, though, it could be arguably one of the most important days in the school's calendar, a day when we remember the founders of the school and certainly value their legacy. We are indebted to the people who had the vision that led to the creation of our school back in 1963 and who have contributed to the leadership and vision of that school since. To be honest, nowadays a lot of schools get really excited about building a new classroom, so have a think about the vision and courage that was required all those years ago to start and build a whole new school. The establishment of Rathkeale in 1963 made sense to a lot of people in the Wairarapa here, and thus the trinity of schools, Rathkeale, St Matthew's and Hedlow, were complete. Rathkeale first opened its doors in 1964 with about 60 students enrolling. From its early days, Rathkeale grew quickly, and at one stage over 300 boys boarded here at Rathkeale College. So none of the education from which our college has become known for would have happened without the foresight of the original founders and governors of the school, who set out with the expressed intention of developing a school which provided an excellent education for its students. We owe them a debt of gratitude. Without them, this fine college simply would not exist, and that's why we honour them on Founders Day each year. And it's wonderful to have so many old boys here back at the school. It is my belief, I've done a little bit of research, and it's my belief that next year we will have in Year 9 our first third generation Rathkeale student, having had his father and his grandfather attend this school. So we're certainly looking forward to acknowledging that special moment. Just before we move on to more important business, I just want to cover off some presentations of long-serving staff members, which is always done on Founders Day here at Rathkeale. And so we want to acknowledge milestones of those staff that have achieved significant milestones of service for the school. Now, the first one of those is the acknowledgement is for 10 years service at our school. Now, this person is our Mr. Adam Gordon, one of our deputy principals, and this is to acknowledge his 10 years of service at school. Mr. Gordon joined Rathkeale from an overseas post and immediately made an impact in the music department as head of music. He's been heavily involved in the performing arts side of the school, and for the last few years has also been one of our deputy principals. I'd have to say the school singing here is the best I've ever seen in New Zealand, and this is largely due to the work that Mr. Gordon does on a weekly basis with essentially every boy in the school. Now, while this may not be the most appropriate thing, I'm actually going to ask Mr. Harper, as our special guest, to do a little bit of work here, because as president of the Rathkeale Old Boys Association, I'd like him to present the acknowledgement for 10 years service for a staff member with the presentation of an Old Boys tie to acknowledge that service. Now, when a staff member has done 15 years, we acknowledge that by presenting them with a school crest like this here, and we're going to do that to one staff member today. But sort of in keeping it in the family, we always acknowledge 20 years of service as well. They get a certificate, and then they are able to convene a special dinner which we convene for them to celebrate that milestone of 20 years. In this case here, I'd like Mr. Harper to present this 15 years service crest to Mrs. Kavette van Devenaar, and the 20-year certificate acknowledgement to her husband, Mr. Dion van Deventer. So if they'd like to come forward, please. Thank you for that, Grant. I promise I won't give you any more work to do today. Some honourable mentions here. We do have another staff member who's completed 15 years, and that is Mr. Jones. But unfortunately, he was unable to be with us here today, so we will acknowledge that next term. Also, some honourable mentions. Mrs. Diane McBride has completed 31 years here at our school. I think it's important to continue to acknowledge this length of service. Mrs. Maureen Vaughan in the boarding house has done 30 years. Mr. Cliff Bouton has completed 32 years, and Mr. Greg Bailey has completed 36 years. And I think that deserves a round of applause and acknowledgement. So that leads me very nicely to the final staff member to be acknowledged, and that is Mr. Grant Harper for his 40 years of service to the school to date. And to be honest, boys, any school organisation, for that matter, would consider it an honour to be able to acknowledge 40 years of loyal service by an employee. We have a number of people here today who are going to speak to you about Mr. Harper's involvement and contribution to Rathkeale College over the past 40 years. Of course, Mr. Harper was also a student here at Rathkeale for 5 years as well, so that association with Rathkeale College actually exceeds those 40 years, and that will probably be referred to today along with the fact that he's been a faithful employee of our college. So it's my pleasure to invite some of our guests here today to speak about Mr. Harper from a variety of experiences. And the first person who's going to do that, and just for the benefit of the people that are not contacted with, not with the school on a day-to-day basis, Mr. Graham Anderson is going to be our first speaker. Mr. Anderson is a current staff member here at Rathkeale College. He arrived in New Zealand from South Africa in August 1997, and after a term at Twizel in the South Island and 6 years at Wairapa College, he joined the Rathkeale staff at the beginning of 2004 to take up the position of Head of English and to teach Year 13 Art History. In his first year, he took on the role of Year 10 Dean and teacher in charge of hockey, also acting as the first 11 team manager. Over the next few years, he coached the first 11 hockey and then took on the manager's role again when the previous coach returned to take up the reins. He has also volunteered to assist as a temporary head of Halberg House, a post that eventually lasted for 3 years. He's also produced 2 musicals in his early years here, and then with Mrs. Simpson co-produced the hugely popular musical Les Miserables. So with 16 years of experience working with Mr. Harper and as a current staff member, it's my pleasure to welcome Mr. Anderson to speak to you today.
Thank you, Mr. O'Grady. Can I be heard at the back? Okay. Right, good afternoon. Someone once asked me in my first year here in 2004, when I was walking around with parents on a Parents' Day, what was so special about this school compared to others in which I had taught, and that was probably about 5 or 6 at least. I didn't even have to hesitate about my answer. The quality of the grounds, I said, is what lifts my heart as I drive in each morning. And it's the quality of the grounds that forms the basis of my contribution today about Grant Harper. We are indeed fortunate that Grant's parents were perceptive enough about his interests when he was a young lad to choose a school that they knew would suit his personality. They rejected Wanganui Collegiate and Lindisfarne in favour of Rathkeale because they thought that the land, approximately 120 acres of it, with the bush and the river, would suit him better than a school within a town. And they were quite right. Grant remembers that his first term job as a Year 9 boarder was pulling out weeds behind Burma Road on what is now the Eco Trail. So he was blooded really very early on. John Norman told his parents that he was very like an English schoolboy, as he tended to wander around looking at trees. And it is that love of trees which has helped transform the Rathkeale campus into what it is today, some 50 years later. The environment has always been crucial at Rathkeale, from the 1925 hiring of Albert Buxton to landscape the grounds for the Maunsell family, which he did with both natives and exotics. And the first students, who were only allowed home 3 times per term, worked hard. The bush might have been out of bounds, but that didn't stop them from going there, and they lived at the river. When Grant left school in 1971, his parents gifted a number of trees to the school, and originally those were going to form an avenue, apparently, to line the entrance road to the school. However, they were actually planted to make a line from Rugby House to the river, and from that we can start to see that lines of trees have become an important part of Rathkeale. Grant returned for a single year in 1975 and then came back in 82. He's been here ever since and has done a massive amount of planting in those years. One of the first things he did when he arrived here was to plant a row of trees between the playing fields, something which John Norman, the first headmaster, was not particularly thrilled to see when he returned for a visit, as he muttered that he had envisaged an open space between the fields. However, Grant did manage to get John Norman back on side, and he also used John Taylor to back him up when the board wanted to put the artificial turf on the oval, which would really have spoiled the flow of that particular space. From 1982, Grant was incredibly fortunate. He was totally given carte blanche in terms of planting and the grounds, and has been able to continue his love of trees from that time. For about 15 years, he roped detention boys in to help with the gardens in the afternoons, especially the bush, as the bush had become increasingly important over the years. With his son James, he planted all the trees on what was originally the golf course. And for more than a decade, the New Zealand Studies Group has planted trees. Many of the trees on this campus, apart from the oaks and some others planted by John Norman, owe their existence to Grant Harper. And then we come to the Jubilee Quad. Grant explained that Willie Kirsten had a nice feel for the grounds. He wanted the walls around the quad to reflect all the past students of the school, and at the same time thought of tidying up the quad. Together, he and Grant hired Hamish Moorhead, an old boy, to come up with a plan, and the resultant quad, with its careful lines and plantings, is a fitting central focus of the school. One of the things which Grant dislikes intensely is chainsaws. He did explain that he's not averse to cutting out a diseased tree, but feels that far too many people become trigger happy when they have a chainsaw in their hands and can, on a whim, destroy specimens which might only need some judicious pruning. There is an anecdote, which is possibly apocryphal, that has him taking off in the middle of a conversation with someone when he unexpectedly heard a chainsaw starting up. Gardeners frequently have to demonstrate foresight that extends beyond their own lifespan, given that trees will often not reach maturity till long after their planters have passed on. They are a gift to future generations who will enjoy their shade, their beauty, their changing colours signalling the progression from one season to another. Grant's gardening foresight has created a beautiful and spiritually satisfying environment that will be enjoyed by future generations, and for this, generations of boys still to attend Rathkeale can be thankful to him. Rathkeale has benefited from Grant's superb knowledge for almost 40 years. In fact, it is for 40 years. And so it was with trepidation that I tried to find a word which could best describe this legacy. I quickly rejected facilitator. I pondered over custodian, but I think that the most fitting way to honour Grant is by using the Maori word kaitiaki, a carer, a guardian, a protector and conserver of the environment, in this case of Rathkeale College. Thank you, Grant, for your unstinting contribution.
Thank you very much, Mr. Anderson. It's now my pleasure to welcome Mr. Edward Cox to speak to you today as well. Edward is the youngest of the Cox boys to pass through Rathkeale in the late 1970s and 1980s. He followed his brothers Alistair and Gerald, and Edward started in 1983, boarding in Schoolhouse and then in Cranley. He rates his greatest achievement as being made a sixth form tractor driver. That's year 12 for those boys that are sitting here in front of us. He looks back fondly at the education he received and the support from his parents Hyatt and Barbara while here. Edward has been followed at Rathkeale by his nephew Hamish and by Edward's first two sons, Thomas and now Matthew, who's with us here today. So the family's connection is important to him. Edward is the secretary of the Rathkeale Old Boys Association, largely because he once, according to him, he once organised a good drinks function. After leaving Rathkeale, Edward qualified as a lawyer and had a very successful legal career and is currently a partner with the law firm Gibson Sheep. Edward has a number of perspectives from which to speak about Grant, including a former student, a boarding house member, Old Boys member and a current parent. So please welcome Mr. Edward Cox to speak to us today.
Grant, Vicky, Alice, James and Hannah and your families and friends, it's an honour to mark this occasion and celebrate the wonderful achievement that has been Grant's teaching at Rathkeale for the last 40 years. I've got so much to say and there isn't time to say it all, so boys, I will try and keep in some of the best stories, keep it interesting, but for everyone else and for the old boys, this is a really important occasion for us to be able to mark all that Grant has done. Speaking on behalf of the old boys has its own pressures. I'm conscious that what I say today should be representative of the 5,000 or so boys that have passed through these gates, and I'm pleased to see that a great number of them are here today. If I stray off the task, I expect I'll get a nod or a discerning look from the back of the room. The pressure is only increased by the fact that the president of the old boys is that great lover of the apostrophe himself, one Murray Grant Harper, 1967-1971. That is all the more so when we know that Grant hates being singled out, is likely to brusquely brush off praise, and I suspect he would far rather answer his cell phone in assembly than be in the spotlight today. As old boys, we have a unique perspective on Grant and all he has done for the school. For every one of us from 1967 onwards, Grant, 1979 onwards, you have been a senior staff member and even an acting principal, if I have the term correct. For those whose tenure was intersected with your years as a boy, I'm told you were that boarder from Hawke's Bay, noted as being quiet and studious, but with an air of dependability and reliability. He was apparently a solid citizen. Strangely then, from another old boy, it has been suggested that Grant was connected to the heist on the tuck shop. That seems oddly out of character. And boys, Harper's 11 just doesn't seem to have the same sort of ring about it. So I'm going to stick with the descriptor of dependable and reliable. For boarders, especially in the mid-70s, Grant, You were the bearded, pipe-wielding superhero, equally capable of kayaking, apparently, and hosting discussion sessions in the Cranley Library. They were called kōrero. You were the subject of a 3-page spread of the boys' satirical and possibly subversive newspaper, Hard Times. It was dedicated to you under the caption of a man for all seasons. Whatever he does with 100% effort and the right spirit. When I arrived in 1983, Grant's beard was gone, replaced by the ubiquitous sports coat, or that icon of the 1980s, the blue double-breasted blazer. With Vicky and family living at Cranley, the once active outdoorsman now had 90 boys to control. As old boys, our perspective of Grant changes again when we leave this place and we stop relating to him as a staff member, but instead as someone who is the ongoing embodiment of the place we came from, an idea I will return to later. So, for old boys, we know Grant through several different phases of our lives. We have known him when we were boys here, a great many of us sitting exactly where you are now, but without carpet, I might add. And he has been here when we returned to our schools in our younger adult days. Finally, for an increasing number of us, he has been here when we have brought our sons through the gates for the first time. That same warm smile, firm handshake, and a new sports coat. Greeting us now man to man and welcoming us back into the Rathkeale community. There is a certain reassurance about that. Finally, Grant has been a stalwart of our Old Boys Association, but that is for another day. And in saying that, I want to acknowledge the other old boys who are on the staff who must surely also be approaching some type of long service milestone, including my contemporaries, Mr. O'Gorman and Mr. Ewington. And that might be about the long and the short of that. Come on. But today is about celebrating Grant's role in the teacher as a school, rather than his contribution to the old boys. Grant, it is no exaggeration to say that there is no one who knows more about Rathkeale than you. This potential was recognised early in the 1975 Rathkeale College record, reading suspiciously as if it had been written by B.G. Hamilton. Grant is an old boy, it said, and he knows what school is all about. We very much value his loyalty and enthusiasm and the great rapport he has with the boys. We need him back when he has completed his degree. In 2000, when John Ansell's year group from 1973 had their reunion, Badger described you as the soul of Rathkeale. That description reflected not only that you understood what it is that makes this place special, the importance of learning, of an education that's fully rounded, of understanding history with a questioning lens, of community, of coming from a particular place, the importance of our families and the physical environment in which we lived and learned. Grant, your classroom lessons and my learning only crossed a few times, but what you taught us about Te Ao Māori has stuck with me ever since. What is more, the perspectives and critical history you gave us has withstood my own history degree in 3.5 decades. And there was no more tangible learning about the experience of tangata whenua than when you took us to trees on the grounds that still bore the adze marks of our predecessors on this land who had carefully cut strips of bark for their whare hundreds of years ago before us. But it is, of course, your role as a housemaster that I remember most. It was a toss-up today whether I wore my old boys tie or my Cranley house tie, so I bought them both. Let me start by saying I'm eternally grateful, Grant, that you have either forgotten or consigned to history all of the stupid things I did. I do not think you have changed at all in the last 35 years, and I thank God I have. In the following account, some of the names have been changed to protect the innocent, but otherwise everything else is 100% accurate, according to my memory. Physically, Cranley in the 80s was as Repton is now. Those of you in Cranley, you are living in five-star luxury compared to the Spartan cell we lived in. But what it lacked in material comforts, Grant, you ensured Cranley made up for in the atmosphere you promoted. At a time when the school and the culture could be robust, to put it kindly, Grant ensured that Cranley was a house where everyone could feel secure and be free to be the wide range of individuals we were. It was from those efforts that Cranley came to be known as the family house. And it was from that, Grant, that you acquired your famous nickname, Ma Harps. I do not think you were a mother to us, but you ensured that values of caring, or at least tolerance, pervaded, and the terrors of bullying and the over-the-top physical behaviour were largely sidelined. When it came to discipline, Grant, you were no soft touch in those days. You ran a tight ship, and the creaking of your leather brogues on the cork floor quickly brought everyone to attention. But equally, you were humane, approachable, and interested in us. You were practical, and you knew that boys would be boys. Your solution for two boys in my year group, who were both prone to sleepwalking out of the same window, was simply to clear the garden below. You had little tolerance for swearing, and with bat-like hearing, you could detect it, even from your own house. Your tactics to eradicate colourful language were effective, although they might possibly not pass aero muster now. Hamish Edge remembers your foul-mouthed tonic, which he says still remains the hottest and most putrid curry mix ever experienced. Lesson learned: do not swear in the vicinity of Murray. What did all that teach us? Learning to be tolerant, learning to live with others, and probably one of your favourite sayings of the time, that manners maketh the man. Vicky, I'd like to acknowledge your contribution to the school as well, especially in those days when you lived in school. You had your arms full with your own children, who are now sitting over here, and you were a contrasting calm and feminine presence, the perfect panacea to a busy boys' boarding house. I may have told you this story once before, but I only ever saw you riled once. You stormed down B-dorm, demanding to know the F word. We said it was Daniel Gentry and he copped it. Grant, you really needed to raise your voice to make clear your views. Often the greatest admonishments were administered with a simple, quiet comment about your displeasure. A look could say it all. You knew the power of public embarrassment as a means of reining in trouble, and you administered it to great effect in the court, that great court of schoolboy public opinion, the common room at prayers. Maybe this story might show that. On the night of the great Cranley House raid, there had been no prior warning to us boys. All anyone could hope was that in the stripping of beds, the turning out of drawers and cupboards, we would not be incriminated. Prefects were dispatched to the dorms and we waited. Back to the common room, you led the searches. In a stern tone, you exhibited the normal items of contraband, that had been found and punishments were announced. But the best was kept for last. Nick Hodson, it wasn't you, but I'm looking at you. Holding up a pair of frilly black knickers, you simply asked one embarrassed senior if he would like to explain what he was doing with these. These lessons about the exercise of authority were taught by example and have come to be valued by many. That mix of fairness and firmness was your hallmark. When questioned, many old boys will say that it is the physical environment of Rathkeale that they relate to most. And as Mr. Anderson has just said, Grant, your contribution to that is enormous. But it is another quality of yours that I want to talk about now. It may be trite to say, but you have always known how to talk to boys. Your role in the school has always commanded respect, but most importantly, you have returned that respect to the boys you have taught. It showed in the little gestures, like that signal you used to do, I don't know if he still does it, that signal you used to do as you walked into another teacher's class, indicating that we should not stand. I'm reliably informed that your recent practice is to insist on a handshake from junior classes as they come in, and that sportingly, you offer a light but swift counterpunch to anyone whose hand does not grasp yours. From that respect, many old boys have reflected to me that you are a great listener and that you provided that empathy and understanding to them. A relatively younger older boy, who might want to remain anonymous today, wrote to me, I found Mr. Harper to be someone you could talk to about pretty much anything, from nearly the names of every tree when it was planted at the school to more serious matters of when I was called into the principal's office about a disciplinary matter that I didn't agree with. He would pull me aside and be able to make me understand through the frustrations. Another, from my era, Pete McCutcheon, emailed me and said, I would like to say that Grant Harper made a big difference to me at Rathkeale. It felt as though he was always interested, engaged, caring, and with something to say. I really appreciated Grant, and I'd like to thank him very much for his kindness. Other sources I have spoken to from recent times tell me that going for a walk with Mr. Harper has become a euphemism for kōrero on all that is troubling someone. And all of that under the pretense of going to have a look at the river or check on some planting. And it is perhaps that at that point, Grant, that I should return to that part of your being here at Rathkeale that is almost unique to the old boys. Many of us, when we leave, do not return for a considerable time. But an experience by so many old boys returning has been to find that you are still here, and that in so many cases you know us and you recognise us. It is one thing to have a personal sense of attachment to a place, but it is quite another to be recognised as belonging to that place by someone who knows you from when you left. Grant, we also celebrate your knowledge of the families and connections of Rathkeale old boys, your ability to name boys back through the ages, who their parents were, where they came from, and what those old boys are doing now in adult life is a rare asset. It is also just one of the reasons why we're never going to let you resign from the old boys. If anyone knows the whakapapa of Rathkeale, it is you. And it has been built up through the years by your interest in the boys and the families who have become part of the Rathkeale community. And to ao Māori, there is a concept of ahi ka, burning fires of occupation to show possession of land. Hopefully, without doing too much injustice to the concept, I can make a connection to a similar phrase, that of keeping home fires burning, sometimes referring to preserving something that is precious, but potentially imperilled. Grant, many old boys are very grateful that you have always stayed and helped steady the ship through tougher times when we here the school face challenges. When we come back and we see the school now in such good shape, we are grateful that you had your hand near or at times on the helm in your senior leadership roles. Grant, there is so much to celebrate about your 40 years teaching and simply being here, but I sense it's time to stop for me. If I carry on, I suspect I'll get told off by the President at our next committee meeting. So let me finish by saying, on behalf of the old boys, those who have gone before and those that you are part of, thank you for everything you have done for Rathkeale, for all of yourself that you have given to this place. And we celebrate you achieving this fantastic milestone of 40 years. I hereby declare that you are a good Rathkeale man.
Thank you, Edward. Who's going to be speaking to us today. And our last guest speaker is Mr. Bruce Levick, who brings to our assembly the perspective of one of Grant Harper's former principals here at Rathkeale. So Bruce immigrated from South Africa and started teaching mathematics at Rathkeale College in 1975. Initially, he was a housemaster of Innisfree, an overflow boarding house in town before Rugby House was built. Later, he became housemaster of Winchester House and then deputy principal and finally principal at Rathkeale College in 1991. In all, he served Rathkeale College for 21 and a half years. He has also been a principal of Ruapau College in Awakuni, taught in England, South Africa and the USA, trained in Pakistan and principal in the Solomon Islands. He has written a series of mathematics textbooks for the Oxford University Press in Pakistan and a history of Wellesley College for their centennial in 2014. He rounded off his career working as a senior advisor in the Ministry of Education. Bruce, it's wonderful to be able to welcome you back again to Rathkeale College and to speak about Grant today.
Tēnā koutou, ko Soutsponsburg, tōku moana, ko Limpopo, tōku awa, ko Bruce, tōku ingoa, nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. About a year ago, a junior student was called over by Mr. Harper while he was walking around the school campus. The lad, I think, was about to do something wrong, and the student said to Mr. Harper, "Who are you?" I'd like to thank him for two reasons for asking that pertinent question. Firstly, it reminded the school authorities that Grant Harper was now only working part-time as a development officer, and that there were two generations in the school that did not really know him. Secondly, there's a lot to know about Grant Harper. You've learned quite a lot already, and I'll share with you some other thoughts. So who is Grant Harper? He's the son of a farming family from Hawke's Bay. His parents sent him to Rathkeale College in 1967 when the school was only about 3 years old. His enrollment number was 230, so he was very early on in the school career. So even in the fourth year of the school's existence, the school was only about 2/3 the size of what it is now. So what was Rathkeale like in the 1960s and 70s when Grant Harper was here as a student? The school was divided, or the year was divided into 3 terms, not 4 as now. There were very few day students and the rest were all boarders, full-time boarders, no weekly boarders, no day boarders. The school was on this site but was surrounded by farms. The only houses between the school and the main road were the farmer's cottage and the owner's cottage down at the junction of the main road. The road was unsealed and there was a cattle stop at the second bend. There was one classroom block and a second was added later. The gymnasium was shorter by 2 bays than it is now. And if you look back there, you'll see that the wood on the roof is different to the wood that's on this one, and they pushed the hall out a little bit bigger as the school grew. The boys built the Greek theatre, the Burma Road, so called because the labour that built it was not totally voluntary, the Hobbies Village, the Canoe Reach, and endless paths and roads. At one stage, the headmaster enrolled 16 more students than there were beds in Cranley and Repton. So they built bunks on top of the beds that were already there, and they doubled up for a number of years. The boys didn't seem to mind, the fathers didn't seem to mind, but it perturbed the mothers. Students built their own canoes out of wooden canvas and sealed them with a tar-like substance. They tested them in the Canoe Reach and then paddled them in the Rumahaga River. At weekends after sport, they were allowed to go for a tramp in the Tararuas. The kitchen provided the rations and a minibus took them to the foothills. Expeditions of about 6 students, led by a senior student who had first passed his first aid certificate and various survival tests, would lead the tramp up into the mountains, usually to Blue Range Hut, but on a number of other routes as well. No master was in evidence, and the senior boy was in charge. Teachers on odd occasions would visit them, but for the rest, the boys were trusted and went into the hills on their own. Form and health and safety regulations in those days were minimal. The staff were very different to the staff of today. Some were not even trained teachers. The art teacher had been a sign writer. The accounting teacher had been an electrician. The technical drawing teacher had acted on the stages of theatres in London. The mathematics was taught by the chaplain. The headmaster's wife taught music, and the physical education teacher had been a pipe major in the Scottish Fusiliers. The latter had fought in World War II and maintained that there were no atheists in the trenches. These unorthodox men of the world prepared the boys for the real world. I hasten to add that there were some impressive academics in their ranks as well. Grant Harper thrived in that environment. That is the Rathkeale College that got under his skin and into his heart. On qualifying as a teacher and a spell teaching in England, he returned to Rathkeale College as a teacher. Later, he became the housemaster of Cranley, senior master, deputy principal, head of the senior college, and at one stage acting principal. He taught English and social studies. He was well-read and well-travelled, thus adding spice to the lessons. I, though, would not just think of him as an English or social studies teacher, but as a teacher of students. The welfare of the students was always paramount in importance for him. He taught them English, but he also taught them what was right and what was wrong. He taught them etiquette. He taught them manners. He encouraged them to think, to question, and to debate issues. He liked and respected the students, and in return, they liked and respected him. He introduced te reo and also Māoritanga to the college. Taha Māori, for the most part, was not part of curriculum in those days, but they came here before this was mandated by the Ministry of Education and the Education Review Office. He went on to be a strong family man. The success of his 3 children is testimony to that. His wife Vicky is to be thanked for the support that she has given him in so many ways over so many years. The grounds have been his passion, and he can name all of the trees and has planted many of them himself. What is the measure of this man, though? Of the students who were at this school in the 20+ years that I served here, some of them have made bad decisions down the line. In fact, 3 of them have actually gone to prison. One was a quiet, well-behaved student, one was a likeable rogue, and the other one was a very cultured young man and able academically. In other words, they were just like you. Who they were and what they did is private and not important. But what is important is how you would have reacted to the news of finding that they'd fallen on hard times and made bad decisions. You would read about it in the newspaper, and would you just turn the page and go on from there? Would you have condemned them? Would you have disowned them? Would you have reasoned that they got what they deserved for what they had done? Or are you a nice sort of person who would have wondered what had gone wrong in their lives to drive them to make such ill-considered decisions? Those are noble thoughts, and I appreciate them, but it is actions that count. Would you have written to them while they were in prison? Would you have tried to restore the self-respect of those people? Would you have supported them at a harrowing time in their lives to try and put the tattered remains of their lives together again? That is what Grant Harper did, and that is the measure of this fine man. The winds of time will buffet you. Some will hit you face on and stop you in your tracks. In time, you'll pull your coat around you and zip up your parka and lean forward and carry on under your own steam. Some winds will come from behind and life will be sweet. Some gusts will hit you from the side at 150 kilometers an hour and knock you down. How long will you stay down? Or who will help you up? Or who will you let help you up? The winds of time and the winds of fortune will blow, and there's nothing you can do to change the direction or to affect them in any way at all. What you can do, however, is trim your sails so that you can make the most of whatever wind blows. The next time you see Grant Harper wandering around the campus, you won't have to ask him who he is, but go over to him and have a chat. I can guarantee you that you will come away well satisfied and richer for the discussion. What will you answer in 50 years' time when you're in your 60s and a teenager comes up to you and asks, "Who are you?" What will you answer when you look back on your lives? What if Grant Harper will have rubbed off on you? Will you and your wife have been a successful team? Will your children have done you proud and made successes of their chosen careers? How well read will you be? How many trees will you have planted? Will you be able to name all the trees on this campus? How many of the calls of the birds that live in those trees will you be able to recognize? Will you have traveled the world? Will you be able to speak te reo? Will you be culturally sensitive? What will your attitude be towards Maori, Pacifica people, to Chinese, to Indians, and to modern New Zealanders who come from all the corners of the world to make up the rich tapestry of this country? Will you have coped with changed times, attitudes, and norms? How many of the ridges and the Tararuas will you have tramped? Will you be a constant?
You guys, you want to just stand up, turn around, and sit down again if you want to stretch just for a minute while I find my glasses. Thank you. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko hui mai ki kone e tēnei rā. Ka te haiha haui tō koutou aroha. Mr. O'Grady, trustees, family, colleagues and boys of the school, I've just thanked you for your presence here today and for honouring me with this very humbling assembly. And a very sincere thank you also for that glorious piece of art. At a glance, I see the schoolhouse bush or the Burma Road at night, and I'm sure it'll be a source of joy going forward for a very long time. Thank you very much. Mr. Levick, Mr. Cox, Mr. Anderson, thank you for your kind words. As I said to someone outside, it almost feels like a funeral wake in advance, and certainly it's almost worth waiting for 40 years to hear such kind sentiments, so thank you very much to all of you. Now, I hate to think how geriatric I must seem to all you young men sitting out there. I remember being unimpressed when my older sister behind me turned 30. She was so old. And now I'm having to own up to having been here for 40 years. However, I have to say, and this is something that people out the back and some behind me will recognise, those 40 years seem to have sped by remarkably quickly. And as you've learnt, my contact with this place actually goes back a few more years to 1966, when my parents, my grandparents, and I motored down from Hawke's Bay for an interview. We turned off State Highway 2, down a long gravel driveway, and eventually entered a patch of dark, rather gloomy bush. Perhaps a bit like that over there too, before opening or driving out onto that wide area of lawns in front of the schoolhouse. My interview with the headmaster was in his drawing room, now a storage area in schoolhouse, and it subsequently transpired that I was accepted for the 1967 intake, and the rest is history. Your maths, which will be better than mine, will tell you that I've therefore hung around here for about 45 years. And that's something that worries me somewhat. I can probably blame my parents for some of that, though, their example and their interests. My father, as you've heard, a Hawke's Bay hill country farmer, spent all his life, apart from his boarding school years and his time away with the army in World War II, living and working on the same property. And no one thought that was strange or boring. But perhaps influence also came from my mother, a teacher and a primary principal during the war years, who used to tell me that schools were amongst her favourite places and that she and Dad had some of their happiest times here at Rathkeale, probably on the sideline of the rugby field watching my younger brother play for the first 15, or those end-of-year friends' cocktail parties, rather boozy events, I think,
held over at the racecourse at the end of every year. Certainly, I've loved my time here and loved most of my time as a student. I even, perhaps strangely for some of you, shed a couple of tears when the time came to leave at the end of 1971. I was off to Massey University to prepare for a career in regional planning or town and country planning, and I was leaving Rathkeale for good, or so I thought. 3 years later, as secretary for the Save the Heaphy Track campaign, a group trying to stop the government from roading that famous walking trail, I was in the Wairarapa talking to groups which included Rathkeale boys. On that occasion, the headmaster cornered me and suggested I spend the following year as a teacher and tutor here in Cranley. I had no degree, no teacher training, and no experience. But that's exactly what happened. At the beginning of Term 1 in 1975, I was advised not to smile before Easter and to cane so hard that the word got out and students lived in fear and awe of me. Well, I failed on both counts, but things seemed to fall into place, and I loved that first year of teaching. And as a consequence, I transferred to an English degree at Canterbury, took up a tutor's position at Christ College with Bruce Hamilton, who we farewelled a few weeks ago, with his brother as my housemaster. Completed my teacher training, even though founding headmaster John Norman had advised me that the best teachers never go to Teachers College. And I then accepted a position at Ashburton College for 2 years before heading to the UK with a very new Mrs. Harper. 1980 and 81 was spent at 500-year-old Bromsgrove School in Worcestershire. A wonderful, wonderful experience for both of us. On our way home from my brother's wedding in late 81, a message arrived in Kathmandu, Nepal, advising us to contact Headmaster John Taylor at Rathkeale. The outcome was a housemaster's job in Cranley, following on from Mr. O'Gorman's father, Liam. And although Vicky was tearful, sorry about this, Vicky, was tearful over the prospect of living in Masterton, we haven't quite worked out how to leave again, and 40 years on, here we still are. Now, I'm not sure what that says about us, but it certainly says plenty about this place, its beauty, its spirit, and its wider community of parents, old boys, staff, trustees, and last but certainly not least, its students. The ensuing years have been full, and you've heard some of this already, have been full of memories, of joys, disappointments, and opportunities. A roller coaster of experiences emanating from a wide range of roles, including, and in no order, Housemaster of Cranley, Dean of Year 10, 11 and 13, Senior Management, Head of Senior College, Careers Advisor, Grounds and Dining Hall Liaison, responsibility for gardens and for detentions, and that was a really good combination, those two. Reunion and Jubilee Organisation, the Archives, Auditorium and Gymnasium Committees, Uniform Committee, a bit of magazine and book writing, Trinity Foundation and the Old Boys. There have been sports coaching and managing the First 11 hockey, master in charge of skiing and outdoor pursuits, numerous camps, marae trips, tramps, including a 10-day one to Fiordland, and I see one member of that group here, school trips to Vietnam, to Europe, to Japan, and to America. Rather importantly also, I have to confess, there have been English, history, geography, art, Māori, horticulture, social studies, religious studies, and New Zealand studies classes. Not least with the years of teaching sexuality, classes that my son James over there wagged. Our 3 children, Alice, James, and Hannah, all called this place home. And they all completed their education. Within Trinity. Now I sense that good memories emanate from growing up in this place and from having the entire campus for bike riding, for learning to drive on the common, for swimming, for tennis, and much more over the holidays. Vicky has sometimes suggested that the family has had to share me with Rathkeale, and especially with the 87 full boarders in Cranley. There probably is some truth in that, especially during the 15 years we lived on campus, and I apologise for any shortcomings there may be in my parenting role, and I sincerely thank them for their support. It would be fair to say that I've invested emotionally in the school and its environment. Now that's a danger, when you hang around so long, is that you can become somewhat proprietal. New trustees, new principals and staff, all with new ideas and changes, can be a challenge. New ground staff with chainsaws can certainly take a toll. My indignation knew no bounds when a highly placed Trinity trustee declared at the time of integration that she did not know what all the fuss was about. After all, Rathkeale was just a few prefabs in the middle of a few paddocks. I am still indignant. But it's a reminder, you know, of just how vulnerable places like this are, and that the changes wrought by time can threaten their very existence. We need to look after Rathkeale. Fortunately, Vic and I learnt long ago, when living on campus, that it was important to generate a life outside the gates, and that contact with the wider community would be important for our health and our sanity. Many of the guests here today have helped enormously in that regard, as have Rotary, the Friends of Queen Elizabeth Park, people at Aratoi, amongst many others. And we do thank you. We are gradually weaning ourselves off the demands of full-time teaching and of 20-something or other years in senior management. New challenges and interests are emerging. There's a new house to build, rather slowly thanks to COVID, some writing and paintings to do, a Clivier nursery to develop, and a world to revisit when we are able. There are cycling trips on our new bikes booked and far-flung family to see more of. However, work at Rathkeale as president of the Old Boys, as a trustee of the Rathkeale Foundation, and with special projects continues. And those staff and students who have located my cupboard/office and who drop in regularly are special, even if they are often rabble from last year's Year 9 New Zealand Studies class, and you know who you are, or persistent handshakers from last year's Year 10 English class, and you know who you are, hello, or former marketing students seeking another trip to the Batch Cafe in Martinborough or another trip to the field days. Contact continues beyond the gates also. In this shrinking world of the internet, we seem to know more and more about each other. In the last few days, messages have arrived from Brunei and from the Canterbury High Country, from California and the UK, from Australia, and from around New Zealand. One message recalled a small historical fact shared with a class in 1975, and another thanked me for teaching him rose pruning technique. You know, as teachers, we don't always know the impact that we are having. Visiting a hotel in Greytown a couple of weeks ago, the old boy at the bar took off 10%. I said, "What's going on here?" He said, "That's what happens when you hang around Rathkeale for 40 years. And last week at the supermarket, there was no charge for my bag of apples for the same reason. The Rathkeale family is certainly widespread and more in touch than we sometimes expect, and that is good. But I do need to wrap up this word fest. You've been sitting on hard seats and a hard floor for a long time. You've been patient, so thank you. To all of you here, thank you for travelling the journey with me in whatever way you've travelled, as wife, as family, as colleagues, and I'm really conscious of many of you and your long service to this school when I say that. To the support staff, and to one very, very special principal's PA who's saved my skin so many times and has forced me to learn how to use a computer. As students and as friends and members of the wider Trinity family, thank you. Thank you to the 9 principals under whom I've worked and who have kept me in employment thus far. Thank you again, Mr. Levick, Mr. Cox and Mr. Anderson, for your kind and special words. Thank you to you boys for maintaining the spirit of good Rathkeale men and being utterly polite this afternoon. I do appreciate that. Thank you for the Trinity Schools Trust Board for their largesse today, and to the other groups who have contributed to that special painting over there. And finally, thank you, Mr. O'Grady, for masterminding and hosting this assembly. an unexpected honour, and I certainly feel truly honoured, so thank you. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
In the hall, boys, please. So on behalf of us all, thank you very much, Grant. That was a fantastic address. There is one more special thing we'd like to do, and so from here, what I'd like you to do after our final song is to move from here and gather outside the college library, where we have a very special ceremony that we'd like to do to conclude this whole assembly this afternoon. So in a moment, I'll invite you to be upstanding for our final hymn, and then immediately after that, there'll be instructions about how to leave to go to being outside the library. So thank you very much. Would you all please be upstanding?
Thank you very much, boys. In the hall, please. Guests and staff, if you'd like to make your